Welcome to the Hindu Daily. So imagine waking up just weeks before the biggest election of the decade, right?
Right, tensions are already high.
Exactly. And you find out the people running your state's security apparatus have just been, well, abruptly fired and replaced by an outside referee.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that is exactly what the Election Commission of India, or the ECI, just did. They ordered the overnight transfer of the Chief Secretary and the Director General of Police in West Bengal.
That is a huge move.
It's stunning. And this comes right as the 2026 election schedule was announced for Assam, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, and Puducherry. Okay, let's unpack this. Are we honestly supposed to believe that without moving these specific top officers, free and fair elections are completely impossible?
It's definitely a stretch.
To me, it feels a bit like, a referee suddenly marching onto the field and just firing the team captains right before the opening whistle.
I see where you're going with the referee analogy, but it's actually much more complicated than that.
Awesome.
Well, a referee usually operates strictly within the league's rule book, right? What's fascinating here is the legal framework the ECI is using to justify this kind of sweeping action. It honestly borders on rewriting the rulebook entirely.
Wait, rewriting it? How?
They almost always point to Article 324 of the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court of India, specifically in the landmark 1978 Mohinder Singh Gill case, did rule that Article 324 is a plenary provision.
Meaning what, exactly?
It acts as a massive reservoir of power for the ECI to, ensure elections are free and fair. But the court explicitly added a massive caveat.
There's always a caveat.
Always. They said that reservoir can only be tapped into when there is absolutely no existing law occupying that space.
Right, so they can't just invent new powers if Parliament has already passed a law covering the issue.
Precisely the point of friction here. The officers being transferred belong to the All India services. Their transfers are heavily regulated by a very specific existing law, the All India Services Act.
Ah, I see.
Furthermore, under the 7th Schedule of the Constitution, state public services fall under the exclusive day-to-day control of state governments.
So the state government's supposed to be the boss here.
Exactly. So by forcing these transfers without the state's consent, the ECI is essentially bypassing statutory law. In that same 1978 ruling, the Supreme Court warned against the ECI acting as an imperium in imperio.
Wait, imperium and imperio. Let's translate that from legal speak for a second. Are you just saying they're acting like a rogue agency?
Essentially, yes. It translates to an empire within an empire. The court was warning against creating an unchecked parallel government that answers to no one during election season.
Yeah, an unchecked power is, well, fundamentally alien to the constitutional system.
Right. And the ECI relies entirely on state machinery to conduct its gigantic exercise. So branding civil servants as lacking integrity right on the eve of an election without any transparent procedure showing how they reach that conclusion
Just creates massive demoralization. Think about the power dynamics in your own workplace for a second. If an external auditor suddenly walked in, fired your boss based on some vague assumption of bias, and then refused to show the evidence, the entire office would grind to a halt.
Nobody would know who to answer to.
Right. It exposes the severe limits and the potential for overreach when domestic institutions try to flex their muscles. But, that question of who actually holds the power and what happens when rules are bypassed, it's actually a great lens for our second article today, which looks at international power dynamics.
It's a very similar dynamic, yeah.
Let's shift our focus to the March 29 meeting in Islamabad. You had the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt sitting down with Pakistan to explore ways to end the ongoing war in West Asia between the U.S. and Israel on one side and Iran on the other.
It really looks like a grand diplomatic breakthrough on paper, getting those specific players in one room.
It does look great on paper. And here's where it gets really interesting. The glaring flaw in all these grand mediation talks is the underlying mechanics of war. A ceasefire fundamentally requires exhaustion.
And neither side is even close to being exhausted yet.
Not even close.
Huh?
Look at the United States. Their goals under President Donald Trump have shifted rapidly. First, the stated objective was denuclearization.
Right.
Then it morphed into regime change. Now, after a whole rung of Iranian leaders were killed, the goal is just this undefined surrender. The ultimate aim really seems to be securing total control of the Strait of Hormuz, similar to how they secured the Panama Canal historically.
That's a huge geopolitical play.
It is. Meanwhile, Israel is banking on this completely unrealistic hope for an Iranian people's uprising to dismantle the leadership from the inside.
Yeah, that uprising theory fundamentally misunderstands how revolutions work during wartime.
How so?
Well, any intelligence expert will tell you that a successful uprising requires a carefully selected, organized group to lead it, and it almost always has to happen in the first few weeks of a conflict.
Before everyone just gets exhausted.
Exactly. Beyond that window, the population is purely in survival mode. Negotiating peace while facing a furious, bombarded public is nearly impossible for any leadership. Israel's real mechanical objective appears to be the permanent decimation of Iran's entire strike capability.
Which they haven't achieved yet.
Right. Since that hasn't been achieved, Tel Aviv will remain completely lukewarm toward ending the war.
So we are stuck in a stalemate where no one actually wants to stop shooting.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a true ceasefire isn't just a signed piece of paper. It requires a physical process.
Like actual troops.
Yes. When there is absolutely zero trust, and remember, the U.S. attacked Iran while negotiations were ongoing, and Washington accused Israel of escalating things by attacking the Pars gas field, you need a physical peacekeeping force on the ground to provide actual security guarantees.
And to get a physical force in there legally,
Yeah.
you need a United Nations mandate, which feels impossible with a completely deadlocked Security Council.
It is deadlocked, but history offers a fascinating mechanical blueprint for bypassing that deadlock.
Really? Yeah.
During the 1956 Suez Crisis, the Security Council was completely paralyzed by France and the UK, who were, active participants in the crisis. So the UN General Assembly used a mechanism called the Uniting for Peace Resolution.
Okay, what does that do?
It basically allows the broader Assembly of Nations to override the Security Council and authorize peacekeepers.
Wow, I didn't know they could do that.
They can. It worked. But it only worked because U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower aggressively twisted the arms of his allies. The hard truth about international law is that the UN only functions when a massive superpower forces the issue.
So it still comes down to brute strength.
Pretty much. Today, China might try to persuade Iran, but they aren't going to put direct security boots on the ground.
Right. And you might be wondering why India isn't jumping in to mediate this conflict, given its relationships in the region. Our sources suggest that instead of stepping into the zero-trust minefield, Indian diplomacy should use this moment to rally the global south at the UN.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does. Fostering a united global opposition to the war is a much stronger play than getting lost in dubious bilateral mediation ventures that are just doomed to fail.
It's a calculated strategic distance. But let's bring it back to domestic strategies. We've been talking about how nations attempt to manufacture peace on the global stage. Our third article today looks at how an individual attempts to manufacture political power entirely outside the traditional party structure.
Exactly. Let's look at Tamil Nadu, where the political debut of film actor Vijay is making massive waves, right as election campaigns swing into high gear.
It's a huge story right now.
It is. Now, there's a very common assumption here. People look at Tamil Nadu's deep history of actors like MGR and Jayalalitha turning into chief ministers, and they think being a massive movie star is just a fast pass to political leadership.
A lot of people definitely assume that.
Right. But I really want to push back on that narrative. The early stalwarts of the Dravidian movement, like C.N. Annadurai, didn't enter politics through cinema. It was the exact reverse.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they brought their already formed grassroots politics into cinema because they explicitly needed a mechanism to bypass the traditional media, which was gatekept by socially privileged groups.
This raises an important question about the actual mechanics of the current political landscape in Tamil Nadu. We really have to look at the voting data.
What does the data show?
There has consistently been a non-Dravidian vote share, roughly 15 to 18%, that floats between alternative forces. We saw it captured by the MDMK, then the DMDK, and now it's fragmented among parties like the NTK and personalities like Kamal Hassan.
It's a very crowded space.
Very. Director Seaman, who leads the NTK, represents a clear ideological space rooted in Tamil nationalism. He is doing the grueling work of building an ideological base. In contrast, Vijay's appeal so far seems completely devoid of that grassroots ideology. It relies heavily on the projection of mere heroism.
It's the classic angry young man movie template. The lone hero punches his way through corruption in 2 hours.
Which is a dangerous template to project onto reality. There is a massive difference between publicity and public-mindedness.
That's a great way to put it.
Public-mindedness involves grappling with deeply complex societal questions and building collective, often tedious organizations to solve them. Publicity just projects a single messianic figure as the ultimate cure-all.
Right, it oversimplifies everything.
The Dravidian movement succeeded because they used a Gramscian approach. They occupied the ideological state apparatus of popular culture.
Wait, Gramscian approach?
Yeah.
Ideological state apparatus.
Right.
Let's translate that from sociology
Mhm.
speak. Are you basically saying they realize that whoever controls the movies controls the voters' worldview?
Yes, exactly that. Antonio Gramsci was a philosopher who argued that you don't just win power through elections. You win power by making your ideology the common sense of the culture.
Ah, I get it now.
The Dravidian activists didn't let the cinema create their movement. They used the cinema as a delivery vehicle for their movement. Today, the risk with celebrity politics is creating an apolitical base, a base that simply transfers its loyalty to an on-screen hero without ever questioning the underlying systemic issues or demanding actual policy solutions.
So it makes you wonder, how do you evaluate leadership when you go to the ballot box? Are you seduced by that invincible hero narrative? Or do you look for the sustained, grueling grassroots organization that actually drives lasting social change?
It's a tough question.
Because as much as we love watching a hero solve a systemic problem in a movie, the reality for everyday people facing systemic issues is a much harsher, unscripted battle. And that brings us to our fourth article today, which looks at an arena where there are absolutely no cinematic heroes, our healthcare system.
The struggle for survival there is grounded entirely in cold, earthly economics.
It really is. We are talking about the financial ordeal of India's organ transplant patients. The pure scale of the issue is staggering. We have roughly 500,000 Indians who need an organ transplant every single year, but only a tiny fraction actually get one.
It's heartbreaking.
And the sources share some incredibly tough mechanisms behind these stories. Take Ganesan. He received a kidney from a deceased donor in 2023. He thought his struggle was over, but then his private insurance repeatedly rejected his claims post-surgery.
Just unbelievable.
Or look at Naveen, who had a kidney transplant in 2016. A decade later, he is paying 15,000 rupees every single month, entirely out of pocket, just for his immunosuppressant drugs to ensure his body doesn't reject the organ.
Yeah, the financial burden doesn't end with the surgery. In many ways, that's just the beginning.
So, what does this all mean? It reveals a devastating irony in how healthcare economics work. A patient might actually get the high-profile transplant surgery itself, covered by a state scheme or insurance, but they are left completely entirely on the hook for the years of pre-surgery dialysis, the endless hospital consultations, and the lifelong post-surgery medication.
It's a half measure.
To use an analogy, it's literally like being gifted a brand new engine to save your dying car,
Yeah.
but being completely denied the money for the gas you need to actually run it.
That's spot on, and it goes deeper than just the recipients. We must also look at the mechanics of how donors are treated. In 2023, out of over 16,000 total donors in India, more than 15,000 were living donors.
Wow, so mostly family members giving up a kidney or part of the liver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yet private insurers purposefully structure their policies to exclude donor screening, the transportation of the organ, and post-operative care for the donor.
But didn't the regulatory bodies step in to stop that?
They tried. The Insurance Regulation Development Authority of India, or IRDI, actually mandated that both donors and recipients must be included in health insurance coverage.
So why isn't it happening?
Because insurance companies often exploit loopholes or simply drag their feet on compliance, denying claims through layers of bureaucratic red tape. Furthermore, they aggressively penalize donors.
Think about the cruel reality of that mechanism. If you made the brave, selfless choice to donate a kidney to a loved one tomorrow, the insurance industry doesn't view you as a hero. They instantly reclassify you as a high-risk liability.
That's the tragic part.
They can hike your premiums astronomically or deny you fresh health coverage entirely because you are now missing an organ.
And that reclassification creates what healthcare economists call the missing middle. You have patients who are wealthy enough to afford private care, where over 75% of India's organ transplants actually take place.
Right.
On the other end, you have the very poor who qualify for state-run schemes in places like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Kerala. But the vast majority of people fall in the middle, too rich for state aid, too poor for private lifelong care.
So they just fall through the cracks.
Completely. Without a unified model to ensure post-transplant care, graft rejection, where the body attacks the new organ simply because the patient ran out of money to buy their daily medication, is heartbreakingly common.
It is a painful struggle for survival. But while that struggle is grounded in earthly economics and human biology, our fifth article looks at how humanity's drive to survive is pushing us beyond Earth entirely.
A completely different scale.
Yeah, and the budgets required for this next leap make even the most astronomical earthly healthcare costs look like absolute pocket change.
We are entering an entirely new, highly industrialized era of space exploration.
On April 2nd, IST, NASA launched the Artemis II mission. It is monumental. They are sending 4 astronauts, including the first woman, Christina Koch, the first person of color, Victor Glover, and the first non-U.S. citizen, Canadian Jeremy Hansen, beyond low Earth orbit for the first time since 1972.
It's been a long time.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They aren't even landing on the moon.
Wait, really? Just a flyby?
Yes, this is a 10-day mission where they are just slingshotting 7,500 kilometers around the far side of the moon.
Oh.
The entire point is just to test the Orion capsule and its modified 5-meter heat shield, which has to endure temperatures up to 5,000 degrees Celsius upon re-entry.
That is intense engineering.
It is, but you really have to question the mechanism behind the staggering $93 billion price tag for this program, especially since NASA isn't even using new tech. They are just recycling the exact same Space Launch System configuration they used back on Artemis I.
It seems financially absurd until you look at the geopolitical mechanism driving it. What's fascinating here is the underlying motive for this massive expenditure and NASA's sudden, panicked overhaul of its schedule.
And what's the motive?
The motive is entirely China.
Why this sudden rush, though? I mean, we've already been to the moon.
Because we haven't been to the lunar South Pole. The South Pole has permanently shadowed craters that escape the drastic boiling temperature swings of the lunar surface. Because they are permanently shadowed, they contain ancient water ice.
Okay, so they have ice. Why is that worth billions?
Whoever sets up physical infrastructure there first essentially gets to dictate the economic and geopolitical rules for everything that follows in space.
Ah, that is the key right there. You are quite literally watching a new era of colonization unfold. That water on the moon isn't just up there for astronauts to drink. The mechanics of it are game-changing.
It's all about fuel.
Exactly. Water can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen. It is the potential rocket fuel that will power the next century of human expansion. Whoever controls a water ice controls the only gas station in deep space.
Exactly. It completely changes the payload economics of traveling to Mars if you don't have to carry your fuel all the way from Earth. And China understands this mechanism perfectly.
They usually do.
They are moving incredibly fast.
Yeah.
They are aiming for a crewed landing by 2030. They already have their new Long March 10 rocket. They are actively testing the Mengzhu crewed spacecraft this year, and their Lanyu lunar lander is expected to fly between 2028 and 2029.
That is a very aggressive timeline.
NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman explicitly stated that the U.S. had to eliminate delays just to compete with their greatest geopolitical adversary. That's why NASA downgraded Artemis III from a landing mission to a mere docking test in orbit, pushing the actual U.S. moon landing to Artemis IV in 2028. China's timeline basically forced NASA's hand.
It's a high-stakes race. If Artemis II fails this flyby, the cascading complications could halt the U.S. program for years, potentially handing a monopoly on lunar rocket fuel to China.
And building that kind of massive aerospace program, whether it's the state-driven approach of China or the commercial coalition model of the U.S., requires colossal corporate engines.
It takes a village, or, well, a megacorporation.
Right. To understand how nations physically build the kind of multi-billion-dollar structures required to fund these ambitions, we have to look back at Earth. Specifically, our sixth and final article today examines the East Asian economic titans.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sheer scale of these corporate structures is mind-blowing. If we look at South Korea, their entire economic structure is dominated by the Chaebols.
The Chaebol are fascinating.
They are these large, family-controlled multinational conglomerates. They rose to prominence in the 1960s under President Park Chung-hee, fueling the massive post-war recovery known as the Miracle on the Han River. We're talking about players like SK Group, Hyundai, LG Group, and Samsung.
Household names, basically.
Globally, yeah. I was blown away by this statistic, though. Samsung alone represents over 20% of South Korea's entire GDP. Just imagine the leverage of a single company owning a fifth of the United States economy.
It provides incredible top-down efficiency for national projects, but it comes with a severe dark side.
I can imagine. What happens to the smaller guys?
The mechanism of the Chaebol structure fundamentally stifles local small and medium enterprises. Because the Chaebols have guaranteed government loans and subsidies, they monopolize all the capital and all the top engineering talent in the country. A small startup simply cannot compete for funding or staff.
So innovation gets bottlenecked.
Yes. Furthermore, they are so heavily integrated into the state that there is a deep systemic history of corruption.
Right, they become essentially above the law.
We saw it clearly when Samsung chairman Lee Jae-young was actually convicted in 2017 on charges of bribery and embezzlement linked directly to former South Korean President Park Geun-hye.
And did he serve his time?
Well, because Samsung is structurally too big to fail without collapsing the national economy, he was predictably pardoned in 2022.
Wow, must be nice.
Japan, however, offers a really striking structural contrast to the Chaebol model.
How so? Did Japan avoid the family monopoly problem?
They had it, but they were forced to dismantle it. Before World War II, Japan had similar family-controlled business empires known as the Zaibatsu. The big four Sumitomo, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Yasuda completely dominated the landscape.
Wait, Mitsubishi? Like the cars?
Yes, but back then, they didn't just make cars. The Zaibatsu were sprawling empires that owned the banks, the shipping lines, the mining operations, and the manufacturing plants. They owned the entire supply chain.
That is an insane amount of power for four families.
It was. But after World War II, the U.S. occupying forces moved to dissolve the family-controlled Zaibatsu system to democratize the economy. What they eventually morphed into are known as the Keiretsu.
So how is a Keiretsu different from a Zaibatsu?
It's mostly about management and cross-shareholding. The Keiretsu aren't controlled by a single family bloodline anymore. They are much more professionally managed coalitions of companies that own shares in one another to protect themselves from hostile takeovers.
But they still wield massive political influence over the Japanese government, don't they?
Absolutely. You cannot analyze Japan's corporate landscape without looking at the Keidanren, the Japanese Business Federation. It boasts over 1,700 corporate members.
That's a massive lobbying bloc.
Exactly. For decades, the Keidanren possessed immense lobbying power and utilized a mechanism of making massive, coordinated political donations, primarily keeping the Liberal Democratic Party in power to ensure favorable corporate tax policies.
Does it still do that?
It wasn't until a major political shift in 2009 that the Keidanren officially stopped making those direct centralized donations. Their influence has become more subtle now, but they remain the dominant architect of Japanese economic policy.
It really makes you step back and look at the massive gears turning behind the news. If these massive Asian conglomerates can dictate national economies to such an extent, heavily influence domestic politics, and drive the global innovation that fuels everything from the smartphone in your pocket to the next lunar space race, are we moving toward a future where mega corporations hold more actual geopolitical power than the very nations that birthed them? Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.